ourselves in the movies, we find ourselves in paintings. And art is one of the most exquisite ways that human beings have found to not only represent ourselves in the world, but also to witness ourselves. And to be psychologically grounded and connected, we all need to feel witnessed. And art helps us replenish that capacity for witnessing ourselves and each other and connecting to the wider world. So, it's really important in a way that art isn't supplemental in our lives. It is essential. And so,
thanks for tuning into our podcast. We love having you here, and it's our mission to bring you all the latest and greatest tips, skills, and know-how to make you the best that you can be. We know that you have it in you, and we're going to show you how. Now, let's get started.
Okay.
Good to have you once again on Live by Omobola Stephen. This is your host, Omobola Stephen. Live by Omobola Stephen is a self-improvement, personal development podcast with the occasion of expert and professionals who come to the show to share disruptive Mindshift content on topics on the personal development and self-improvement. Being a podcast on self-development and personal development has been a worthwhile career for me today. Today, I have Micheal Alcée, who is a clinical psychologist and a mental health educator. Now, Micheal will be sharing creative, disruptive ways of rethinking mental health and much more. Welcome to the show, Micheal Alcée.
So nice to be here. Looking forward to our conversation together.
All right. So nice to have you, Micheal, on the show. Now, I'm looking forward to your professional expertise on today's topic of discussion. Micheal, your expertise interests me. Now, tell me, how are you able to juggle between these two conflicting but important priorities in your career, specializing in the psychology of artists and the professional development of therapists?
Yeah, it's funny that many of us think of artistry as separate from our mental health, but I think that's what really makes therapy so interesting. What makes life so interesting is when we can connect our personal creativity with our creativity, whether we're an artist or at work, any ways that we can bring the two together. So we actually are built as contradictions in a way. As human beings, we have these different sides that we're always trying to figure out how to collaborate with. So in a way, I feel like my job as having these different areas really complement each other. Because whether I'm working with therapists and helping them develop, or I'm working with musicians or artists who are trying to develop, or people who are non-artists, it's all about trying to figure out how to bring it all together.
Right. Great job you have here, Micheal. So let's talk neurobiology. Now, this is very interesting also. How can it teach us to live a more artful life? Now, I emphasize artful life.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's so funny. We tend to really think a lot about our logic and our thinking and our planning, which is fantastic. We need that as human beings to work towards goals. But sometimes we forget that our feelings often come first. Our more right brain, dreamlike, creative, free-flowing aspect is what we want to kind of tap into and bring that together with our more analytical, goal-oriented ways of being. So when we do that, we have the best of being and doing. And oftentimes instead of being human beings, we're human doings. And that can lead us to a lot of anxiety, stress, depression, conflict, confusion. So it's really interesting. If we look at the neurobiology, there's a British psychiatrist named Ian McGilchrist, and he wrote this wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary. And he talks about how our right brain, like I said, the emotional, empathic, free associative, creative, dreamlike parts of us, that side is actually the master. And the left brain, which we know for our logic and language capacities, that is the emissary. And often throughout Western civilization, throughout civilization over thousands of years, we've often privileged the left brain over the right, and we really should make them co-equal partners.
Right. Now, I understand that art is very important and it's also necessary for mental health improvement. What is your opinion on this?
Yeah, we find ourselves in art. We find ourselves in fiction when we read a great novel. We find ourselves in the movies. We find ourselves in paintings. And art is one of the most exquisite ways that human beings have found to not only represent ourselves in the world, but also to witness ourselves. And to be psychologically grounded and connected, we all need to feel witnessed. And art helps us replenish that capacity for witnessing ourselves and each other and connecting to the wider world. So, it's really important in a way that art isn't supplemental in our lives, it is essential. And so, when people come to therapy, they don't think they're going to have an artful experience, or they don't think art might be that important. And yet, so many people actually suffer for minimizing or denying the significance of art. Like I said, imagine if you didn't go a day without listening to music or watching a great drama on television or in the movies. It would be virtually impossible for you to really be able to process your own experience and understand others more deeply without it. So I like to think that we are scientifically built to create art and to appreciate art because it helps us to become more fully human.
Right. Now, many changes is definitely coming our way in the face of COVID-19. And I'm sure, you will agree with me on this. Now, tell me, how can we psychologically improvise and deal with these changes?
Yeah, we've all been dealing with so many changes coming at us so very fast, and they seem to change every day or every hour. And I think one thing that we need to do at the very start is to normalize this, to say that this isn't the exception, it's the rule. That life is like a good piece of jazz music where there's lots of chords coming at us, but there is a melody and there is a way of figuring out how we can make something musical out of these different changes. And sometimes instead of trying to force the changes to be something else, we have to go with what is coming at us. That's what a good jazz artist does. That's what a good musician does, is they don't try to change or force something. They try and figure out, what can I do with this? What can I make of this? And, while COVID-19 has been really, really challenging, it's been, could be heartbreaking for some in terms of whether they've gotten ill or seen people get ill or pass away. But it's also presented us with other interesting opportunities to rethink and rework how we live, how we work, how we connect. And so the art of creativity is trying to figure out, what do we do with what are the different changes coming at us? And how can we find some way to make them more interesting? And also to catch our breath every once in a while, to recognize that sometimes we can't control it all. So it's a tough balancing act, I think, for all of us, but we are all in this together in lots of ways. I don't think anybody, it's been almost, in New York here, it's been almost 2 years that since the beginning of lockdown. And I think so many have had to try to figure out, what is this music we're playing? And that's what's interesting about life, is that we often don't know what particular music we're playing until we're in it. And when we get a better sort of psychological ear for it, we figure out, what is this music? How can I make something out of it?
Right. Now, when talking about improvisation, so how important is improvisation when it comes to therapy and clients? Now, I know that this is one area of your expertise.
Yeah, how does improvisation help us in therapy, right? So the goal of therapy is to teach us how to remember how to spontaneously improvise again. See, we start off as children. We start off as children being very free and able to improvise and share more freely what we're feeling or what we're thinking. And as adults, we sort of lose connection with how to do that more fluidly, or we get concerned about how do I represent it, or how is it going to affect others? And so the goal of therapy is to give us a sort of interesting laboratory to work on experimenting with how to improvise with someone who can help us figure out all these things that can seem sort of confusing or challenging. And so what therapy does is helps us notice that the mind is throwing different thoughts at us. Our feelings are coming at us in all different ways. And if we can figure out how to tune in with them and figure out how to put them into words or put them into something creative together, that we can feel happier, we can feel more grounded, and we can feel more productive. So it's really an art that we learn, but we have to cultivate and we have to practice, just like anything else. So I like to think that therapy helps us to live artfully and to think of these amazing combination of capacities that we have to feel and think widely. And, there's sometimes people will come into my office and they'll start and say, they're feeling really upset about something or really confused or angry or sad. And as we just freely kind of open up questions about what's going on, what might this side of you feel? What might that side of you think? As we get to know those different sides, all of a sudden we arrive at new solutions, but also we create something together in that mix. And so looking at ourselves as artful creatures who can create something and discover something new all the time is something that I think is really extraordinary. And I think that's what therapy helps us to do. It's also what good relationships help us do. Therapy is nothing more than a kind of helpful relationship.
Now, Michael, don't you think that introverts, right, they are more vulnerable to depression and decreased mental well-being as compared to extroverts, because overall findings show this, right? So I know that you're an expert in the field of psychology and mental health. My question is, how can we improve on this situation?
Between introverts and extroverts.
That's right. Now, we understand more that introverts are more vulnerable to depression and decreased mental well-being because of their overall personality trait, right? Because we know that most times they always internalize most of their feelings and the actions, right? So they are prone more to depression and decreased mental well-being. Now, as an expert in your field of psychology and mental health, can you tell us how we can improve on this situation?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Extroverts and introverts both get their energy in different ways. Extroverts really like to be around people. They like external kind of stimulation, and introverts prefer to have more solitude. They prefer a smaller group or one-on-one, and it's about the level of stimulation. And as you said, introverts can sometimes have depression or anxiety, partly because they sometimes don't know how they work best, or they don't understand why they get overstimulated, and they haven't, like, let's say they grew up with extroverted family or extroverted teachers who didn't understand how to help them make sure that they were at the right stimulation levels. So I think it's really, really essential, just as we know whether our car is gas powered or is electric or a hybrid, we should know whether we're an introvert extrovert or an introverted extrovert, one of those hybrids. And if we know better how we work, what our nature is, it will be easier for us to make sure that our needs are getting met and that we're not getting overly drained, whether we're an introvert or extrovert. Because the ironic thing is, this pandemic, there's some research that suggests that the pandemic hasn't hurt extroverts as much. Some research shows that maybe it has. I've certainly met a lot of extroverted clients in my office and friends and family who are extroverts who have said this pandemic has been extraordinarily hard on them because a lot of the ways in which they get their energy have been cut off. So I think it's really important to look at it as a broader issue for all of us. How do we get our energy? How do we get our replenishment? How do we get drained? And how can we know best how to take care of ourselves? And how do we fit that in the different situations that we have?
Right. Thank you, Michael Alcée, for your submission on the topic of discussion. Now, so how can it help us to reach the changes of life? Now, I emphasize changes of life.
How can what help us through the changes of life?
How can it help us to the changes of life?
Sure. Yeah, therapy helps us to be more attentive and notice the ways in which we can shift from one place to the other, sometimes even moment to moment. We like to think of ourselves as one self right? As if this is me and this is, I can always locate myself